Everything she believed in was about to collapse in a single moment. She trusted him with her heart, her future, her entire world. But while she was building a life full of love and hope, a darker truth was quietly unfolding behind her back. Lies, secrets, and betrayal, hidden so well she never saw it coming. Until one day, everything is exposed, and in that moment, her world shatters. But instead of breaking, she transforms. Because this isn't the end of her story, it's the beginning of her rise. Stronger, fearless, and ready to take back everything that was almost stolen from her. The lesson? Not every ending is a loss. Sometimes it's a turning point. The truth may hurt, but it gives you the power to choose yourself. And when you do, nothing can stop you from becoming who you were meant to be. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and support the channel. Your support is what motivates us to keep bringing you more powerful stories like this. Thanks for watching.
The architectural model of the Nightingale Tower gleamed under the recessed lighting, a monument to her husband's ambition. The last of the investors had just left their Chicago penthouse, and the scent of expensive champagne still hung in the air. Behind her, Julian's voice was smooth as polished steel and just as cold. "Clara, we need to discuss the next phase." She was 7 months pregnant. Her mother had been in the ground for less than a month, and the man she had built a life with was talking about their future as if it were another one of his blueprints. But this wasn't about a building. It was about demolition. The other woman, it was her own mentor, Sophia, the art curator, who'd just kissed her cheek an hour ago. The woman who had toasted their baby, her eyes twinkling as she said, "To new beginnings." That same woman had been sleeping with Julian for 14 months. They had orchestrated this entire evening, waiting until after her mother's funeral to finally tear it all down. He called her predictable, said she lacked vision, and offered her a furnished condo in River North and $20,000 a month, a pittance from a man whose firm was valued at $900 million. What he didn't realize, what no one could have guessed, was that her mother, Isabel, the quiet book restorer who lived in a dusty cottage and patched her own sweaters, had been the silent owner of a portfolio worth $4.2 billion, and she had left every last cent to her pregnant daughter. This is the story of a woman who was told her life was over, only to discover it had just begun. She lost a husband and a friend, but found out she'd been a billionaire the entire time. Yet the true inheritance wasn't the stock portfolio. It was a strength forged in secret, something no market crash could ever touch. Stay with me, because this story is a reminder of a lesson and meaning every woman needs to hear. Your value was never tied to the man who walked away. It was never contained within the four walls of a home he owned, or the last name you shared. Sometimes the people you build your world around will be the ones to light the match. Sometimes the hand you held for support is the one that pushes you from the ledge, but their betrayal is not your story. Your comeback is. Isabel raised her daughter with barely a penny on purpose because she believed a woman who discovers her own light in the darkness will never be blinded by someone else's shadow. This story is for every woman who has ever been called too quiet, who has ever been made to feel small, who has ever had to pick up the shattered pieces of her own heart from the floor and wonder how to piece them back together. You were never insignificant. You just hadn't realized the space you were meant to occupy. If this story resonates with you, if you feel that spark of injustice and that flicker of hope, then you have found your tribe. This channel is for women who find their footing in the rubble, women who rebuild, women who remember their own power. If you're not already part of this community, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a chapter. Tell me in the comments, when did you discover a strength you never knew you had? I cherish every single one of your stories, and they fuel the ones we tell next. Tap the like button, share this with someone who needs to be reminded of their worth today. And if you're ready for another story of resilience, check out the video I've chosen for you on the screen. Now, let's begin. The last champagne flute had been cleared away, and the architectural model of the Nightingale Tower was the only guest left in their living room. Behind her, Julian's voice was calm, which was always more terrifying than his anger. "Clara, we need to discuss the next phase." The words sounded like they belonged to a boardroom, not their home, not now. She stood in the heart of their Lakeshore Drive penthouse, barefoot, 7 months pregnant, the silk maternity dress feeling like a costume. The small bites she'd arranged, fig and prosciutto, whipped feta with honey, sat untouched on the marble island. Her mother, Isabel, had taught her that hosting was an act of care, a way of making people feel seen, but she had been invisible in her own home. It had been 26 days. That was all. 26 days since she'd stood in a quiet cemetery outside the city, watching her mother's casket being lowered, while Julian had taken a critically important call by the car. She'd dismissed it as his awkwardness with sorrow. Some people, she told herself, just don't know how to navigate loss. She turned to face him now. Julian stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a silhouette against the glittering Chicago skyline. His suit was impeccable, his posture perfect. He hadn't made a decision. He had approved a demolition order. On the counter beside him, he slid a sleek silver tablet. A digital presentation was loaded onto the screen. It was titled, "The Arrangement." "It's for the best, Clara," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. She glanced at the tablet, then at the leftover canapes, then at the man she had been married to for 36 months, the man who had proposed to her at an architectural gala. She'd thought it was a grand romantic gesture, a public declaration, a man so proud of his choice that he wanted the whole city to know. Now she understood. It wasn't a declaration, it was an acquisition. He had added her to his collection. Why? The word was a whisper, lost in the cavernous space of the penthouse. She hated the weakness in her voice, the way it cracked, turning a demand into a plea. Julian adjusted his cufflinks, a deliberate, practiced motion, the same one he used before presenting a new design to the city council. "Our paths have diverged, Clara. My life requires a partner who shares my trajectory, someone with ambition. I am your wife. I am carrying your son, and you will both be well compensated. I've secured a condo for you in River North. It's fully furnished, 2 bedrooms. You won't have to worry about a thing." A condo. He had already secured it. This wasn't a conversation, it was a relocation plan. And in that moment, she started to see the little details her heart had refused to acknowledge. The scent on his coat last week, not her perfume, but a sharp, expensive sandalwood. Sophia's signature scent. His phone, which was suddenly always angled away from her. The tablet on the counter glowed. He'd left it on, a final, careless insult. "Is there someone else?" she asked, though she already knew. Julian's jaw flexed. His eyes darted to the model of the Nightingale. "This is about us," he said, but his body screamed the lie. She knew that tell. She'd watched him do it with clients for 3 years. When a project was over budget, he'd look at the blueprints instead of their faces. When the truth was inconvenient, he focused on the design. She walked toward the island, not to argue, not to beg. She picked up a small, forgotten cheese knife. She held it, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth of her skin. She wasn't thinking of violence. She was thinking of how easily things could be severed. She stared at the reflection in its polished blade, a distorted, pregnant woman she barely recognized. The baby moved inside her, a strong, reassuring role, a reminder that she wasn't truly alone. Julian watched her for a second, a flicker of something, annoyance, concern, in his eyes. He straightened his jacket. "My driver will be here in the morning," he said, "to help with your things." He walked out. The heavy oak door clicked shut with a dead final sound. Clara was alone in a glass tower that had never felt like a home. She put the knife down and sank onto one of the bar stools, her belly pressing against the cold marble. On the tablet, the presentation for her new, diminished life glowed. She could smell the leftover fig jam, the sharp scent of cheese, and the faint, woodsy perfume that Sophia had left behind. Her mother's scent had been old paper and leather and tea. Her phone lit up on the counter. A text message. It was from Sophia, her mentor, her friend, the woman who had held her as she sobbed after the funeral, the woman who had helped her pick out paint for the nursery, the woman who had sat in this very room an hour ago and raised a glass to her future. The text read, "Heard it went smoothly. I'm here if you need to talk." It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation, an admission. Clara almost dropped the phone. It was the casual cruelty of it, the assumption that she would turn to her betrayer for comfort. The call didn't come 11 minutes after Julian left. The text came before he was even out of the building. They were coordinating. She didn't reply. She couldn't. She placed the phone face down on the counter. She pressed a hand to her stomach, where her son was kicking, oblivious. "It's just us now, little guy," she whispered into the silent room. She didn't know it then, couldn't have possibly grasped it, but the text message she didn't answer was the key that would unlock everything. Morning arrived, gray and indifferent over Lake Michigan. Clara hadn't slept. Sometime before dawn, she'd left the living room and walked into the nursery. She'd designed it herself. The walls were a soft, stormy blue, and she'd spent weeks painting a mural of a forest filled with literary creatures from the books her mother used to restore. The crib, a simple maple wood, was assembled with her own 2 hands because Julian had promised to hire someone and then forgotten. She lowered herself into the rocking chair her mother had found at an antique market and refinished for her. It smelled faintly of lemon oil and old wood. A safe smell. She rocked slowly, replaying his words, his posture, his casual dismissal of their entire life. 36 months. He proposed at a gala. Who does that? A man performing for an audience, a man acquiring an asset. She reached for her phone and pulled up her mother's contact. Isabel. Her finger hovered over the call button, then pressed it. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. "You've reached Isabel. I'm likely lost between the pages of a book. Leave a message, and I'll find my way back to you." Her mother's voice, calm and steady. Clara ended the call and immediately dialed again, just to hear it one last time. "You've reached Isabel." Clara pressed the laptop against her stomach, shutting her eyes as the baby gave a soft flutter, a little pulse of reassurance from within. By 11 p.m., she had reached a conclusion. It wasn't a life-altering plan, not the kind that reroutes a destiny. It was the small, quiet decision a woman makes when the world has crumbled at her feet, and she simply needs to find out why. Marcus's laptop was open on the Marble Island. He'd left it logged in. A rare oversight, or perhaps he just never imagined she would look. That was the core of Marcus's view of her. He saw her as scenery, beautiful and placid, and had from the very beginning. It was the bedrock of their marriage, his absolute conviction that she was too gentle, too indebted to him, too blissfully naive to ever challenge his narrative. She didn't need a password. He never logged out. She had been searching for cribs when the notification slid onto the screen. A new photo added to the album, Lake House Renders. A strange name for a gallery. Curiosity, a cold little splinter, made her click. Her stomach plunged. It wasn't blueprints. The first photo was of Sophie. Not Sophie Miller, her best friend. Just Sophie, with a winking face emoji as the caption, a tag of casual ownership that felt forged over many months. Clara started scrolling back, moving toward the album's creation date. Her fingers were unnaturally still, but her breathing was a gathering storm. The album was created 14 months ago. Not a fleeting mistake, not a recent indiscretion. 14 months. Before their first anniversary, before the positive pregnancy test, before her mother got sick, before her entire life as she knew it. There were nicknames, My Muse, S. There were locations, a resort in Scottsdale, a boutique hotel in Miami, a weekend sailing on Lake Michigan during a trip Marcus had called a solo architectural retreat. And there were pictures. Sophie wearing one of Marcus's dress shirts and nothing else, laughing in what Clara recognized as the penthouse of his firm's new skyscraper, the one with the panoramic city view, the very spot where he had asked Clara to marry him on a perfect summer evening. She scrolled on, and the images grew more brazen. A comment from Sophie, posted on the day of Helen's funeral, the day Clara had stood graveside in the damp Illinois soil, feeling the earth take her mother while Sophie's arm was a steadying weight on her shoulders. How much longer until this is our everyday? Sophie had typed beneath a picture of them clinking champagne glasses. Marcus had replied within 3 minutes. Patience, my love. Just have to clear out the old project first. Clear out the old project. As if Clara were a demolition site. As if her grief were a zoning permit to be waited out before he could build something new on the ruins of her life. She wasn't losing her mind. She'd sensed the shift. The client dinners that stretched past midnight. The distracted way he listened to her. The flinch when her hand brushed his phone. The way he'd stopped calling her love when they were close. The uncanny way Sophie always knew Marcus's travel plans before she did. She had felt it, deep in that primal place where instinct screams warnings. She knew. She kept scrolling past the travel logs and the pet names, past the architecture of their lies. Then she found the comments about the baby. Marcus's words typed in the clean, modern font below a picture of Sophie on a boat. The kid complicates the exit strategy, but the trust is ironclad. It won't be an issue. Sophie's reply was a single champagne bottle emoji, a celebration. For her best friend, for the child growing inside her, a champagne bottle emoji. Clara's hands trembled, the laptop tilting precariously. She clutched it to her chest, and the baby delivered a sharp, sudden kick against the hard metal, as if it already understood, as if it were already fighting back. She closed the album, reopened it, closed it, reopened it. She willed the images to reorder themselves into something she could survive, hoping that one more refresh would reveal a different story. A story where her husband adored her. A story where her best friend was loyal. A story where a champagne emoji was just a champagne emoji. But the pixels held their ground. They always do. She dialed Sophie's number, not for a confrontation. She wasn't built for that yet. She called because she had to hear her voice, to hold it up against the evidence and see how the two could possibly exist in the same person. She needed to map the distance between how a person could sound so full of light while being so utterly dark. Clara, hey! Sophie's voice was bright. I was just thinking about you. You shouldn't be by yourself tonight. Come over. I'll order that Thai place you love, and we can binge that terrible historical drama. Every syllable was a poisoned dart, perfectly aimed. The feigned worry in Sophie's tone, the easy warmth. It was a masterclass in deception. A flawless performance from a woman who had been sleeping with her husband for more than a year, while squeezing her hand at her mother's memorial. Maybe, Clara heard herself say, the same words she'd used the night before when he'd asked if she was okay. But now it tasted like ash, like the sound of a vault door swinging shut. She ended the call, walked to the master bathroom, braced her hands on the cold marble vanity, and was violently sick. This wasn't morning sickness. That had passed weeks ago. This was something new. This was the body's primal rejection of a truth so toxic it couldn't be contained. It was truth sickness. Her very cells expelling the poison she had been unknowingly ingesting for 14 months. She rinsed her mouth, staring at her reflection. 30 years old, 7 months pregnant. Her eyes were shadowed, and her mother's old cashmere cardigan, her favorite comfort, seemed to swallow her whole. She didn't look like a woman whose life had just been shattered. She just looked exhausted, like someone who had been bone tired for a very, very long time and was only now understanding why. The most vicious blow wasn't the affair. It wasn't the secret trips or the intimate photos. The worst of it was about her baby, her child, the tiny being she was nurturing into existence, a being that she already loved with a ferocity that eclipsed everything else. A champagne emoji. That was the value they placed on her child. She laid her hands over her belly, feeling the gentle roll of a life that was so profoundly hers. "I am so sorry," she whispered to the child. "I'm so sorry this is the world you're coming into." Then she stood taller. She splashed cold water on her face and dried her hands on a plush towel, one embroidered with the elegant V of Marcus's last name. She had research to do. The laptop held more than just photographs. She was sure of it now. She didn't read the parenting blogs she'd bookmarked or the design articles she saved for inspiration. She spent the rest of the night sifting through the digital debris of her husband's life. And in the gray hour just before dawn, she found it. A folder in his documents labeled Assets. Inside was a file named Marital Agreement. It contained an email chain between Marcus and his lawyer, a Mr. Alistair Finch, from a prestigious firm on LaSalle Street. The thread began shortly after their wedding. Alistair had written, "Marcus, the prenuptial agreement was never executed and filed with the clerk of court. We must rectify this. As it stands, the document is legally non-binding." Marcus's reply was terse. "I'll get to it." A second email from Alistair, dated 2 months later. "Marcus, this is now critical. The prenup is still invalid. If this isn't addressed, Clara would be entitled to half of the marital estate under Illinois law." Marcus's response: "She's too sweet. She won't make a fuss. Drop it." "She's too sweet. She won't make a fuss." Clara read the line 3 times. The first read was a shock. The second was a moment of sickening self-recognition. The third felt like a lit match dropped on a trail of gasoline she never knew she had. Without a valid prenup, she was entitled to 50% of Marcus's firm, his properties, his investments. His lawyer had warned him twice, and he'd ignored the warnings because he thought she was too sweet. His staggering arrogance was his greatest vulnerability, and she was quickly learning that vulnerabilities are where the most powerful truths are hidden. But there was more. A separate chain of emails between Marcus and his mother, Isabel Vance. Isabel, who always insisted Clara call her Mrs. Vance. Isabel, who for their first Christmas had given her a silk robe monogrammed with an M, for Marcus. Isabel, who looked at Clara as if she were a smudge on a priceless heirloom. "Sophie's family is much more aligned with our own," Isabel had written. "This was the match that should have been made from the start. Conclude your current arrangement discreetly." Marcus's reply: "I'm handling it. She'll get the condo and be grateful for it." Grateful, as if her dignity was a gift he could bestow or withhold, as if she should offer thanks for being so graciously discarded. Clara shut the laptop with a quiet click. She walked into the nursery and sank into the rocking chair. Their wedding album sat on a bookshelf. She pulled the heavy, leather-bound volume onto her lap. The cost of this book alone could have paid someone's rent for a year. She opened it. The first picture was of her and Sophie at the University of Michigan, their junior year. They were in their tiny off-campus apartment, grinning, holding up glasses of cheap Prosecco. They had made a pact that night, a silly, earnest promise that they would be each other's maid of honor, no matter what happened. A solemn vow made by 2 girls who didn't yet understand how easily the world could break such things. She turned the page. The proposal. The picture taken by his PR agent showed Marcus on one knee at the construction site of his first major skyscraper, the project that had launched his career into the stratosphere. She was in a simple sundress. He was in a perfectly tailored suit. She had believed it was impulsive, a moment of overwhelming love. He just couldn't wait another second, she'd told the story. He pulled me onto the site and just asked me, right there. She had beamed every time she recounted it. She wasn't beaming now. Now she saw the calculated staging, the perfect lighting, the event on a calendar. It wasn't a proposal. It was a press release. Another page. Her mother at the wedding. Helen, in a beautiful lace dress she had altered herself, standing beside the cake, smiling. But her eyes. Clara saw it now in the stillness of the photograph, the thing she had missed in the motion of the day. Her mother's eyes were full of a quiet, careful reservation. Helen's words from that afternoon came rushing back, spoken softly in the bridal suite. It was a text message from Ava that started it all, just 5 words that felt like a kindness. Thinking of you. How's baby? Chloe had smiled, then decided to find the final baby registry list on their shared cloud drive to send her. But under the family folder, there was another one she'd never seen before, titled Somerset Project. Inside wasn't a project for Marcus's architecture firm. It was a home, a sprawling glass-walled masterpiece on a lakeside plot of land with detailed blueprints and a mood board filled with intimate photos of Marcus and Ava on that very land, his arm around her, her head on his shoulder. Tucked in a subfolder were notes, pages of them, in Ava's handwriting. Our view from the master, one read. A studio for me, an office for you, our new life. Our new life. Chloe closed the laptop, the words echoing in the silent, minimalist apartment Marcus had designed for them. She suddenly couldn't breathe. The clean lines and gallery-white walls felt like a cage. She walked to the balcony, the cold Chicago air hitting her face. She looked down at the city lights, 1,000 glittering lives that felt more real than her own. She pressed a hand to her swollen belly, the baby stirring beneath her palm. This perfect life, this perfect husband, this perfect future. It was all a blueprint for someone else. She didn't cry, didn't scream. A cold, quiet calm settled over her. It was you and me all along, little one, she thought. Just you and me. She spent the next 20 minutes moving with a strange sense of purpose, packing a small suitcase, not with anger, but with the chilling clarity of survival. Just as she zipped the bag, the doorbell buzzed. A courier stood in the stark hallway, a young man with a nervous energy. He was holding a thick, cream-colored envelope from a law firm she had never heard of, Lockwood, Sterling, and Finch. She signed the tablet he offered and closed the door, the heavy paper cool against her skin. Sterling. It was her mother's maiden name, a name Isabel had always laughed off as too stuffy for a small-town librarian, a name that never appeared in the stories she told of growing up in a tiny bungalow near the old steel mills, a life of second-hand books and carefully tended vegetable gardens. The letter inside was formal, requesting her presence to discuss the final dispensation of her mother's estate. It was filled with words that felt like a foreign language, substantial holdings, controlling shares, trust provisions, fiduciary duty. She nearly tossed it aside, another piece of bureaucratic nonsense from a world that had nothing to do with her mother's quiet, simple life of cardigans and overdue book notices. But that name stopped her. Sterling. There was a weight to it, a feeling like a key to a door she never knew existed. She placed the envelope on the polished concrete kitchen island right beside the divorce papers she had already downloaded and printed. 2 documents, one from the man who was building a new life without her, and one from the mother who, it seemed, had kept an entire life hidden from her. She had a choice to make between her broken pride and her child's security. Both seemed impossible to hold on to. She stood there in the kitchen, her reflection a ghostly image in the dark window, and stared at the 2 envelopes. The life she had was an illusion, and the life her mother had might change everything. But not tonight. Tonight, she was just a woman, 8 months pregnant, standing in the ruins of her marriage, trying to figure out her next move. The next morning, her hand trembled as she dialed the number on the letterhead. She steeled herself for a crisp receptionist or a maddening automated menu. Instead, a man answered on the second ring. His voice was calm and warm, the kind of voice that suggested patience was not a virtue but a default setting. "Arthur Lockwood," he said. "This is Chloe," she managed, her own voice sounding thin. "I'm calling about a letter I received regarding my mother, Isabel." There was a pause, not of confusion, but of consideration. "Ah, Chloe, yes, I've been waiting for your call. Your mother spoke of you endlessly. She was so incredibly proud. You knew my mother?" "For more than 30 years, he said gently. "She was a truly singular woman." "May I ask, Chloe, did Isabel ever speak to you about the Sterling family?" Chloe sank onto a bar stool, the cold metal a shock against her legs. The glittering Chicago skyline outside seemed to mock her. "No," she said, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "My mother was a librarian. She lived in a rented bungalow in Naperville. She drove a 20-year-old station wagon, and her greatest passion was her tomato garden. She never mentioned any Sterling family." Arthur Lockwood was silent for a beat. When he spoke again, his words carefully dismantled the entire foundation of Chloe's life. "Your mother was Isabel Sterling, the only child of Jonathan Sterling, the founder of Sterling Industries, one of the largest logistics and shipping empires in the Midwest. At 21, she walked away from her family, changed her name, and chose a different path. But she never walked away from what was rightfully hers." Chloe gripped the edge of the counter. The room seemed to tilt. The baby kicked, a sharp, insistent reminder of the reality inside her, even as the reality outside was shattering. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Your mother," Arthur explained, "maintained her controlling interest in Sterling Industries through a meticulously designed trust. She grew it significantly over the years with shrewd investments, all managed by my firm. She also established a charitable foundation to fund literacy programs in underserved communities. It was all done with the utmost discretion. Your mother valued her privacy above all else." "How much?" The question felt small and ridiculous, like asking the time during an earthquake. "The total estate," Arthur said, his voice even, "is currently valued at approximately $3.8 billion. The number didn't land. It just hung in the air. $3.8 billion. $3.8 billion. The woman who taught her how to patch jeans and make soup from vegetable scraps. The woman who bought her school clothes from thrift stores. The woman who cried with joy when Chloe got a partial scholarship to the Art Institute, saying, 'Now you won't have to struggle so much.' $3.8 billion. The first feeling that broke through the shock wasn't joy or relief. It was a hot, sharp wave of anger. "She never told me," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "My whole life I worried about money. I worked 2 jobs in college. I ate instant noodles for dinner so I could afford art supplies. She watched me do all that, and she never said a single word. She wanted you to build a foundation of your own," Arthur said softly. "She had seen what that kind of wealth could do. Her own father used it as a tool for control. Isabel wanted you to know your own strength, a strength that couldn't be bought or sold. She was going to tell you, Chloe, after the baby was born. She wrote you a letter explaining everything. It's with her legal documents. I can have a copy sent to you immediately." "Please," Chloe said. The email arrived 10 minutes later. Chloe walked into the nursery, the room she and Marcus had painted a soft gray just last month. The half-assembled crib and rocking chair felt like artifacts from another life. She sat on the floor, leaned against the wall, and opened the attachment. Her mother's neat, elegant script filled the screen. "My dearest Chloe," the letter began, "if you are reading this, I am gone. And I am so sorry I never found the courage to tell you the truth face to face. I ran away from the sterling name because money was a poison in my family. It made people measure their love in dollars and cents. I wanted you to grow up free of that, to know that your worth was in your heart and your mind. But this legacy is yours now. Use it to be safe. Use it to be bold. And if anyone ever makes you feel small, you remember that you come from a line of giants. All my love, Mom." Chloe read it once, then twice. On the third reading, she finally broke. It wasn't a quiet cry. It was a raw, primal sob that tore from the depths of her soul, a sound of profound loss and staggering love. She cried for the mother she had known, the quiet librarian, and for the powerful, secretive woman she had just discovered. She cried for the husband she had lost and the future that had been stolen. She cried for the woman who loved her so much that she let her struggle to make her strong. A woman who chose a simple life over a gilded cage and in doing so, gave her daughter the one thing wealth never could, a true sense of self. She folded the letter, holding it to her chest, and began to rock back and forth on the floor, a motion as old as time. She rocked until the sobs quieted, and the silence in the room felt less like an absence and more like a beginning. My mother didn't hide this from me, she realized. She was protecting me for this. The baby kicked, a strong, reassuring thump. Chloe laughed, a watery, broken sound that was more joy than sorrow. She laid her hands on her belly. "Your grandmother," she whispered, "was the cleverest, strongest woman I've ever known, and she just left us the entire kingdom." She sat there for a long time, rocking, breathing, feeling the impossible weight of $3.8 billion settle around her shoulders, not like a burden, but like a suit of armor. The weight of $2 billion settled onto her shoulders like a coat she didn't know she owned. Then she picked up her phone and called Malcolm Price back. "Malcolm," she said, "I need you to keep this completely confidential. No announcements, no press, no contact with my husband or his attorneys." "Of course. May I ask why?" "Because I want to see who people really are when they think I have nothing." There was a pause, then Malcolm laughed, a quiet, respectful laugh. The laugh of a man who had just recognized Eleanor Hargrove's daughter. "Your mother," he said, "would be very proud." Julian called on Thursday morning, his voice crisp and efficient, the same tone he used with junior engineers and the catering service. "I need you to be out of the house by tomorrow," he said. "I'm having a colleague stay for the weekend to finalize the launch." A colleague. He didn't even have the courage to say her name, not even the pretense of honesty. A colleague. "I've arranged for $10,000 a month in temporary support," he continued. "It's more than fair, considering. My lawyer will be in touch." $10,000 a month from a man whose company was valued at nearly $900 million. The absurdity of it was almost comical. It felt like a tech mogul tossing a defunct smartphone to a beggar and expecting a thank you. "Fine," Clara said, her voice hollow. "I'll be gone by Friday." "Good. I'm glad we can be rational about this." Rational, as if corporate espionage and calculated betrayal were tenets of sound judgment. As if evicting your pregnant wife 5 weeks after her father's death was just a strategic business decision. She disconnected the call and stood in the kitchen, gazing at the minimalist Austin home she had designed, the furniture he had chosen, the abstract art he didn't understand, the infinity pool overlooking the hills that had never once felt like it was hers. "Let him think I'm devastated," she thought. "Let him think I'm grateful for his table scraps. He doesn't know I hold the patent that makes his entire company viable." But she wouldn't just burn it all down. That wasn't what her father, the architect, had raised her to be. He didn't teach his daughter to demolish for sport. He taught her that sometimes You have to clear a condemned structure before you can build something magnificent. Friday came. Clara arrived at the house at 10 in the morning with her laptop bag and zero illusions. What she discovered was more insulting than she could have conjured. Simone was there in the home office wearing one of Julian's expensive cashmere sweaters. She was drinking espresso from Clara's favorite mug, the one with the architectural sketch of the Pantheon, a gift from her father. And she was working on Clara's custom-built drafting tablet, the one with the pressure-sensitive stylus calibrated perfectly to her hand. The sheer nerve was stunning. It wasn't just the affair, not just the lies, but the casual appropriation of her creative space, the way Simone occupied Clara's office, using Clara's tools as if she had already taken over the role of chief visionary. "Clara," Simone said, setting the mug down. She walked toward her, arms slightly open in a gesture of corporate sympathy, the kind of move a VP makes before they announce layoffs. "I'm so deeply sorry. I never wanted you to find out this way. I know this must be so overwhelming for you." The words were polished, the tone perfectly modulated. If Clara hadn't seen the video pitch for their secret startup, she might have believed her. She might have accepted the empty gesture and blamed herself, and never known that this was the woman who was not only sleeping with her husband, but was actively trying to steal her intellectual property. "When did you start building the new company?" Clara asked, her voice calm and flat as a blueprint. Simone's mask of concern twitched, a tiny error in the code. "What are you talking about?" "Innovate next. I saw the pitch deck, the one where you toast to your future and joke about how my pregnancy was a convenient distraction." The color vanished from Simone's face, then returned, hard and defiant. The transformation was immediate, like watching an app crash and reboot in safe mode. "Fine," Simone said, her voice losing its synthetic warmth. What lay beneath was brittle and cold. "You want the truth? He was suffocating here. We connect on an intellectual level you can't comprehend. I'm sorry it hurts, but honestly, this partnership has more long-term growth potential." "You stole my server designs," Clara said. Not an accusation, but a statement of fact, delivered with the certainty of a structural engineer condemning a building. "I deserved better than a thief." Julian walked in then. He'd been in the master suite on a call, heard the confrontation, and entered the office. With the unearned confidence of a man who thinks he owns the code. "Let's not get emotional, Clara," he said. "Clara, her full name, not Claire, not Honey. The clinical, detached term you use for a line item you're about to delete." He moved to stand beside Simone, a hand on her shoulder, a united front. The CEO and his star developer standing together in Clara's office, asking Clara not to get emotional about being betrayed and robbed. She studied them for a long moment, observing them. The way they stood together, the way Simone leaned into his touch, a gesture both proprietary and calculated. They looked like a power couple, a real team, and that was the detail that cut the deepest. Not that it was happening, but that it had been happening for so long, they were already a seamless unit. Clara packed nothing. She left the designer clothes, the jewelry, the life that Julian had curated for her. She left everything he had given her because none of it was truly hers. She took only 3 things: her laptop, the first ultrasound photo of her baby, and the original patent filing for her proprietary data center cooling system. The automated gate at the end of the driveway slid open. The guard, a kind man named Hector, who always asked about her father, gave her a sad, knowing look. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you built this place. You deserve better." She managed a small smile. "I know, Hector. It's time to build my own." The gates closed behind her. The house, her award-winning design, receded in the rearview mirror. Each foot of distance felt like shedding a layer of a life that no longer fit. By the time she reached the highway, she was no longer Julian Croft's wife. She was Clara Vance, her father's daughter, and she was done letting others build on her foundation. She sat in her car at a scenic overlook for a long time. She didn't cry, she just sat, her hands resting on her pregnant belly. The leather of the steering wheel was warm. The baby kicked, a small, insistent reminder of the future. Through the windshield, she watched the Austin skyline shimmer in the heat, a city of dreamers and builders. Everyone moving forward, everyone creating something. She did what she always did when a project went sideways. She returned to the drawing board. She started the car, merged into traffic, and drove not to some sad, empty apartment, but to a revitalized warehouse district downtown. She parked in front of a building of sandblasted brick and steel, a place that smelled of ozone, coffee, and possibility. Her design studio. She had leased it 6 months ago, a secret space to create, a place that was entirely hers. The studio was stark and clean. The air was cool and still. For a moment, she imagined she could hear her father's voice. That Sarah was in the studio, humming a blues tune, wiping down the lens of her Hasselblad with a microfiber cloth she'd had since Clara was a girl, but the loft was silent, and the stillness confirmed everything. She stepped over the threshold, let the heavy door click shut, and dropped her weekender bag by the print rack. Her mother's familiar denim jacket still hung on a hook, a faint scent of darkroom chemicals clinging to the worn fabric. The large format camera stood like a sentinel by the window, a behemoth of wood and brass. Not modern, not sleek, but it captured light with a soulfulness Clara had never seen in another machine. Sarah used to say cameras were like people. The most expensive ones weren't always the truest. The truest ones were those that had seen enough of the world to capture its honesty. A series of contact sheets were still clipped to a line, studies of light on water from the Chicago River, her mother's last project. She used to work every evening after dinner, and the faint, acidic smell of the fixer would drift through their home like incense. Clara would fall asleep to the quiet sounds of her work, convinced that all the world's beauty was captured through her mother's eyes. Sarah's reading glasses lay on the light table next to a half-finished cup of cold tea. Tuesday's newspaper was still folded on a stool. He had died on a Wednesday. Clara walked through the space, touching every surface. The bookshelf filled with worn texts on structural engineering. The window where her father had taped up sketches and notes. She opened the drawers of the flat file cabinet, not looking for anything in particular, just reacquainting herself with the tools of her trade, the physical evidence of a life spent creating. In the bottom drawer, she found what she was looking for, a heavy, locked portfolio case. It was old, the leather worn smooth by decades of use. She didn't need a key. She knew the combination by heart. Inside were not photographs, but blueprints, the kind you don't digitize, the kind you protect. One showed a young man with a confident smile standing in front of his first completed building. Her father, barely 25, his eyes full of a fire she recognized in the mirror. He was standing in front of a structure that would go on to win a major award, the start of his legacy. Below the blueprint was a folded piece of architectural vellum. It was the original hand-drawn schematic for the cooling system, the one she had based her patent on. Her signature was in the corner, and below it, an inscription in her father's handwriting added the day she had shown it to him. Proof that my daughter not only stands on my shoulders, but has learned to fly. She was not the abandoned wife. She was the architect. The woman who taught her how to find beauty in a cracked sidewalk had once photographed war zones. The woman who drove a 20-year-old Volvo had prints hanging in the Art Institute. The woman who haggled at flea markets had turned down 6-figure commercial gigs. Clara collapsed onto the floor of the dark room and clutched a box of negatives to her chest. There were no tears. She was beyond tears, in that hollow place where the body is too numb to feel and the mind is too shattered to think. The sun set, casting long shadows across the floor. The studio had no heat. Sarah had always been practical, even in death. The thermostat was set to 60. Clara nudged it up, but the ancient boiler in the basement only answered with a shudder and a weary sigh, producing no warmth at all. She buried herself in every textile she could find: her mother's old college quilt, a heavy canvas drop cloth, the wool blanket Sarah's photo club had given her one Christmas. The baby was agitated, rolling and kicking, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. At 2 a.m, the tightening began. It came on fast and sharp, like a knot being pulled deep inside her. She lay on her mother's narrow cot, knees drawn up, her hands pressed against her stomach. She tried to recall everything from the birthing class about false labor, the practice contractions, the body just rehearsing its lines for the main performance. Not a concern, not at 7 months, not typically. But alone in a cold studio, with the man she should be calling being the reason for her pain, not typically felt like a definite possibility. And possibility felt like a certainty, and certainty felt like her world was imploding. She was utterly alone. No husband, no best friend, no mother. Just a cold room full of a dead woman's secrets and a baby fighting to arrive 2 months too soon. And not a single person on earth knew where she was. She dialed the only number that came to mind: Dr. Anya Sharma's after-hours line, her obstetrician, the woman who had calmly navigated her through every appointment, every scan, every breathless question about what was normal. Dr. Sharma's service. The voice on the other end answered, professional and clear. It's Clara Lowell. I'm having contractions. I'm only 7 months pregnant, and I'm by myself. Okay, Clara. Just listen to my voice. I need you to take a slow breath in through your nose and then out through your mouth. Count to 4 for each one. Can you do that? She obeyed. In, 2, 3, 4. Out, 2, 3, 4. The intense clenching in her abdomen began to soften, the knot loosening its grip. Good, Dr. Sharma said, her voice a lifeline. You're doing perfectly. This is most likely just stress-induced. The baby's fine, you're fine, but I want you to come in first thing in the morning just so we can be sure. Can you do that? Yes, Clara whispered. Thank you. She ended the call and lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling. A water stain bloomed in the corner, shaped like a weeping eye. She'd never seen it before. All those years visiting this studio, and she had never really looked up. Everyone betrays you. My father betrayed my mother by leaving. My husband betrayed me for another woman. My mother betrayed me with her silence. My best friend betrayed me by wanting the man who was mine. What was even mine? A baby who didn't yet know that the world was full of liars. At 3:17 in the morning, she unlocked her phone. She typed *can a marriage survive infidelity* into the search bar. Deleted it. Typed *legal rights for pregnant wife in Illinois*. Deleted it. Typed I know he's cheating on me. Stared at the words. Deleted them too. She turned the phone face down, pulled the canvas cloth tighter around her, and prayed for morning. Morning arrived, as it always does. A knock on the studio door woke her. It was quiet but firm, the kind of knock that says, I've been here a while and I'm not leaving. Clara swung the heavy door open and found a woman on the landing. Late 60s, a cascade of gray hair pinned up messily with sharp, intelligent eyes. She held a brown paper bag that smelled of fresh bread and a large thermos. She wore a worn tweed coat and practical boots. This was Genevieve, her mother's closest friend, a retired journalist who had seen everything and was impressed by nothing. Your mother would have my hide if I let you freeze in here alone, Genevieve said, her voice raspy but kind. She moved past Clara into the loft, setting the groceries on a work table. She opened the thermos and poured 2 steaming mugs of tea, her movements efficient and purposeful. She found a hot plate and a small pan and started melting butter. She didn't pry, didn't offer empty platitudes, didn't say, "I was so sorry to hear about Leo," or "Sarah's lawyer called me." She just cooked, opened the blinds to let in the pale morning light, and created a small pocket of warmth in the cavernous, cold studio. When the scrambled eggs were done, she slid them onto a plate, placed it in front of Clara, and sat opposite her. She took a long sip of tea, her gaze unwavering. "I know about the photographs," Genevieve said quietly. "I know about Leo and that artist, and I know you feel like you're breaking, but you're not. But for right now, you don't have to be anything. For right now, you just have to eat these eggs." Clara ate the eggs. They were the first thing she'd tasted in 2 days. They tasted of salt and butter and an unexpected flicker of hope. Genevieve told the story the way she'd written every news report, factually, without embellishment. They sat at Sarah's cluttered work table, and Genevieve laid out the last 6 months of her mother's life like a developing photograph, the image slowly coming into focus. "Your mother knew," Genevieve started. "She saw it happening. She went to that gallery opening for Isabella, that artist Leo is so taken with. Your mother's eye, she saw things other people missed. The way he looked at her, the way they stood just a little too close. She started bringing her camera. She called it her Suburban Noir Project, an exploration of secrets." Clara listened, her hands wrapped around the warm mug, the baby inside her finally still. She followed them, not like a spy, but like an artist documenting a difficult truth. She took those pictures you found. She wanted to capture the anatomy of a betrayal. She was wrestling with it, Clara. How to tell her pregnant daughter that her world was a lie without destroying her. The photos were her proof, her evidence, but they were also her confession, I think. A confession that she saw it all and couldn't find the words. "The story in the papers about a sudden aneurysm was true," Genevieve confirmed, "but the timing was cruel. She was different, your mother. So tough, so honest. Leo wanted her to photograph Isabella for the gallery catalog. A rising star, he said. A merger of talents. Sarah said no. She told him to his face, in front of me, that she didn't photograph subjects with no integrity. He cut her off after that, called her a bitter old woman. He stopped coming around, stopped calling. Your mother raised you to see the truth, no matter how ugly. And the money, here's the thing about your mother, Genevieve said, leaning in. She was an artist, but she was no one's fool. She knew those photos were the only power you'd have. She never planned to show them to him. They were for you. Her final project was giving you the truth, so you could build your own life, a real one. She met your father. He left. She raised you on her own. She knew you had the strength to do it, too. So she put them all in that portfolio, Clara said, finally understanding. She'd read the label on the box, written in her mother's sharp handwriting, Clara's inheritance. She was documenting it all. The dinners, the trips to that little hotel in Lincoln Park, every lie. None of the people who bought her mother's prints, the critics who praised her stark realism, none of them knew that her last, most personal work was a chronicle of her own family's heartbreak, stored in a simple black portfolio box. Genevieve nodded, a sad pride in her eyes. She was the most honest photographer in Chicago, she said, and the bravest woman I ever knew. The studio buzzer shrieked, a jarring sound in the quiet room. Leo's voice crackled through the old intercom. Clara, are you up there? You weren't answering your phone? Genevieve looked at Clara, a silent question in her eyes. Clara stood, walked to the intercom, and pressed the button to let him in. He arrived on the landing, his hair perfectly styled, his cashmere coat immaculate. He carried a bouquet of lilies. He stopped when he saw Genevieve, his smile faltering. Then he saw the table. The portfolio was open. The prints were laid out in a neat, damning grid. Black and white images, artfully composed, undeniably intimate. Leo and Isabella laughing in a dimly lit bar. Their hands intertwined across a cafe table. A stolen kiss against the brick wall of an alley. There were dozens of them, a complete narrative of his affair captured with his mother-in-law's unflinching, artistic eye. His face went pale, the color draining away until he was as monochrome as the photographs themselves. He looked from the pictures to Clara, his mouth opening but no words coming out. Clara looked at the man she thought she knew at the lies laid bare on the table and felt not the shattering pain of the night before, but a cold, clear certainty. The baby kicked, a single, strong movement. This was her inheritance, not a fortune, not a foundation, but something far more valuable, the truth and a trust, specifically structured by her mother's actions for Clara's future, activated upon the discovery of this betrayal. A future she would now build on her own. The trust shattered with the quiet rustle of a receipt. Amelia, 8 months pregnant and nesting, had been tidying Dr. Julian Vance's home office in their Boston brownstone. A receipt from a high-end jewelry boutique had slipped from his travel folio. It wasn't the 5-figure sum for the diamond tennis bracelet that made her blood run cold. It was the gift inscription details at the bottom. For my darling Chloe, forever and always. Her best friend, Sarah, looked up from her magazine and saw Amelia's face turn to stone. She knew in that instant that this was more than a simple misunderstanding. This was a betrayal. What Amelia did next would have been incomprehensible to Julian, something his clinical, logical mind could never have processed. She didn't throw a vase. She didn't call a divorce attorney. She didn't even call him. Instead, she picked up her phone and dialed the hospital's administrative office, a place she rarely called. "Hi, this is Amelia Vance," she said, her voice eerily calm. "I have one simple question. Does the hospital's travel reimbursement policy for the recent cardiology conference in San Diego cover expenses for a physician's spouse?" There was a long silence, the sound of clicking keys, a page turning, another beat of silence. "I will need to verify that information and call you back, Mrs. Vance," the administrator finally said, her tone shifting from helpful to guarded. The manufactured confidence in his voice had evaporated, leaving behind the distinct echo of panic. Clara ended the call, a real smile gracing her face for the first time in months. She didn't need to contest their marital assets. She had proof she was a foundational partner in his tech company. But she wanted Leo to taste that cold dread, just for a moment. She wanted him to feel the sickening lurch of the world tilting on its axis, to see the fortress he'd built revealed as a house of cards. She walked to the large window overlooking the Seattle skyline, pressing her palm against the cool glass. The city lights blurred. She focused on one, a distant beacon, and watched it until it was sharp and clear. A fortnight was all it took to change the entire game. Clara's power was in her silence. No tearful confrontations, no dramatic posts online, no accusatory voicemails left at 2 a.m. She let the legal process unfold, let her lawyers assemble the narrative. Truth, she knew, always emerges, first in whispers, then as a roar. She retained a top intellectual property firm in the city and filed a lawsuit asserting her co-founder's status, citing fraud, breach of trust during their marriage, and the misappropriation of her architectural designs for his company's flagship product. She claimed her 40% stake. It was never about the valuation. It was about the principle. It was to make him understand that his casual dismissal of her work as just a little side project was the most expensive phrase he had ever uttered. Leo was served the papers on a Wednesday morning. He called her at 10:32. The voice on the other end was unrecognizable, not the smooth, controlled pitch of a CEO, but the raw, frayed edge of a man cornered. The Polish was gone. All that remained was desperation. "What the hell is this, Clara?" he snapped. "You were nothing before you met me." She held the phone to her ear, standing in her childhood kitchen. Her father was at the counter, meticulously slicing an apple, the aroma of cinnamon and warm pastry from the oven wrapped around her like a blanket. "I was everything before you, Leo," she said softly. "I just let myself forget." She hung up. Her father didn't break his rhythm with the apple, but a small, proud smile formed on his lips. Marcus Thorne, Leo's chief technology officer, called her the next afternoon. He was the engineering genius who had built the code on the back of Clara's design framework years ago. Marcus was the soul of the company. Leo was just the salesman. "Clara," Marcus began, his tone heavy and deliberate, "I felt you had a right to know. I've been seeing some financial irregularities. Leo has been funneling company money into a private account, writing it off as R&D. He leased a ridiculously expensive condo downtown last month, not for you. He's making reckless acquisitions to plug holes in the budget. I'm deeply concerned about the stability of the company." "Thank you, Marcus," she said, her voice steady. "I appreciate you telling me this." "The man I started this company with is gone," Marcus admitted. "Or maybe he was never really here." She forwarded the information to her legal team. It was another email, another document, another stone in the fortress of evidence she was building around Leo Vance. The inevitable confrontation happened on a Friday night at a sleek restaurant called the Observatory, perched atop the city's tallest building. It was their spot, where he'd proposed, where they celebrated every anniversary. The corner booth with the panoramic view of the city lights was where he once promised her the world. He chose it intentionally, a pathetic attempt to control the narrative. And he brought her sister, Sophie. That was his other power play. Sophie was wearing a new, ostentatious sapphire necklace, displaying it like a trophy from a battle Clara didn't even know she was fighting. But Clara arrived as a different woman. She was centered, having spent the last 2 weeks at her parents' quiet home. Her father's steady counsel, her mother's cooking, the familiar comfort of her old bedroom. It had reminded her of her own strength. She wore a simple navy dress and the silver locket her father had given her for her 16th birthday. No gifts from Leo, no designer flash, no armor, just Clara. She ordered a ginger ale and waited. Leo led, of course. He always had to lead. "Let's make this simple," he said, his voice tight. "Sign the NDA, take the house. I'll give you $20,000 a month. Be smart about this." "I have a different proposal," Clara countered, her tone even and calm. It was a voice she hadn't heard in years, but one her father would have instantly recognized. "You give me my 40% equity in the company, and I won't release your internal emails detailing the fraud to the board." The color drained from Leo's face, not red with anger, but a stark, chalky white. It was the look of a gambler who just realized his royal flush was a fantasy. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. "Marcus wouldn't." "She's bluffing," Sophie chimed in, her voice a little too high. Clara finally looked at her sister, truly looked at her for the first time since this nightmare began. She saw the woman she'd shared a childhood with and felt nothing. Not fury, not heartbreak, just a cold, empty space. "I'm not," Clara said, "and Marcus didn't have to." Leo's control shattered. His fist slammed the table, rattling the glassware and silverware. The low hum of the restaurant ceased as every eye turned to their booth. A manager started to cautiously approach. Leo shot him a look of such venom that the man froze in his tracks. Sophie grabbed his arm, trying to reel him in. Her face was a mask of fear, not of Clara, but of him, of the man she was now shackled to. The volatile, cornered man who slammed tables and treated staff like dirt. Sophie was getting a sneak peek of her prize, and it was clearly not what she had envisioned. The manager left the bill on the table. Clara placed her card on it without looking. Her hand was perfectly still. She rose from her seat, gave them both a brief, dismissive nod, and walked out of the observatory for the very last time. The consequences were swift. Leo brought in a shark from a downtown law firm, a litigator known for scorched earth tactics. Leo's mother, Catherine Vance, called Clara that night. The call lasted less than a minute. "You will not tarnish my son's name," Catherine said, her voice like chips of ice. Every word was a perfectly sharpened weapon. "We will ruin you." "Catherine," Clara replied calmly, "your son ruined himself. I'm just tidying up the mess." She ended the call. Catherine called back twice. Clara let it go to voicemail. The next week, she met with her uncle, Thomas. He was the one who had stayed behind when her own father left the family's rigid, old money world. He was the patriarch her father had run from, a man who lived in a sprawling mansion on the coast that looked more like a corporate retreat. But the man who greeted her was not the domineering figure of family legend. He was 75 and frail, with the transparent look of a man who had spent too much time alone. His eyes, however, were bright and astute, and they held an emotion Clara knew well: regret. He looked at her, and his composure cracked. "You have your father's eyes," he whispered. "My God, you have his spirit." He took her inside, showing her the library where her father had spent his youth, the workshop where they had built models as boys. He told her stories of her father as a young man, headstrong, brilliant, arguing with their own father over ethics at the dinner table. "I should have left with him," Thomas said, his voice raspy. "I should have had his courage. But I was a coward. And by the time I realized my mistake, decades had passed." He offered Clara the full weight of his resources, his legal connections, his financial advisors, the formidable network he had cultivated for 50 years. Clara agreed, but with one condition. "No press," she stated, "no corporate warfare. I just want to secure my child's future and build something of my own." Thomas nodded, and for the first time, a look of peace softened his tired features. "You are more your father's daughter than you can imagine," he said. That night, Clara and her mother made her dad's favorite beef stew in their warm yellow kitchen. They didn't discuss stock options or lawsuits. They talked about her father. Her mom told stories Clara had never heard before. Her dad sneaking out at 17 to race cars on the old county roads. Her dad, at 19, telling his own father that a man's worth was in his character, not his portfolio. Her dad choosing love over inheritance, choosing a modest life over a gilded cage, choosing to raise a daughter who knew her own value. The kitchen filled with the rich smell of simmering broth and herbs, with stories and quiet laughter. And for a few hours, her father's unshakable integrity felt like a tangible presence in the room. Leo's empire didn't crumble because of Clara. It imploded because of him. Marcus Thorne resigned his position as CTO, citing irreparable ethical breaches in a letter to the board. The tech blogs didn't pick it up, but the venture capitalists did. Without Marcus to manage the tech, project timelines slipped. A major product launch was delayed, costing them $40 million in pre-orders. A key partnership with a European firm dissolved. When news of the lawsuit and the alleged fraud began to circulate, two of their primary investors, old-school funds that prize stability over spectacle, quietly divested their shares. Catherine Vance's social circle began to murmur. Business was business and affairs were common. But defrauding your wife, the mother of your unborn child, and the uncredited genius behind your success, that was a breach of conduct too messy for Seattle's polished tech elite. The invitations to exclusive roundtables and charity auctions suddenly stopped coming. With only Isabel's name, Leo was quietly dropped. Meanwhile, Isabel was making her own discoveries. She had moved into the Chicago penthouse, the one Chloe had meticulously designed and filled with handcrafted ceramics. Isabel slept in the bed Chloe had chosen, used the kitchen Chloe had organized, and wore the silk robe Chloe had left in the closet. But the penthouse didn't feel like the prize she'd imagined. The view of Lake Michigan was breathtaking, but the apartment itself was sterile. It wasn't the temperature, it was something else. The silence was wrong. The gaps in their conversations were vast. Leo would come home late, his eyes glued to his phone through dinner. He spoke to Isabel with the same polished affection he had used with Chloe, the practiced charm of a man reciting lines from a script he'd long since memorized. He started monitoring her social media, casually asking who she'd been direct messaging with, not out of interest, but out of a need for control, a need to own every interaction just as he owned every line of code in his company. He critiqued her posts, subtly at first. That caption seems a little off-brand, don't you think? Then it became less subtle. You need to present the right image, Isabel. We have a certain reputation. After arguments, he would become a ghost, silent for days, withholding any sign of warmth, like a bank freezing an account. It was a punishment of absence, the same tactic Chloe had endured for 23 months. It's the kind of cruelty that works because it makes you doubt your own mind, makes you wonder what you did wrong, chipping away at you piece by piece until you fit perfectly into the tiny box he designed for you. Isabel called Chloe on a Tuesday night, close to midnight, her voice breaking. "He's not who I thought he was." Chloe was in her mother's kitchen in Wisconsin. The baby was sleeping soundly, and the old house was warm. Her friend Maria had just fixed the radiator. A mug of herbal tea sat steaming on the counter. Outside, the Wisconsin night was dark and filled with the sound of crickets. She just listened. She didn't gloat or offer hollow comfort. She just listened, the way you listen to a news report about a storm you've already survived. "I know," Chloe said at last. "I married him." She hung up, finished her tea, and went to bed, sleeping through the entire night. The divorce settlement hearing happened 3 weeks later. Chloe's legal team presented their case with cold precision. The invalid prenuptial agreement, the infidelity, the documented emotional cruelty during her pregnancy, and the financial crimes Marcus had uncovered, hidden crypto wallets, unreported income, company funds siphoned off for personal luxuries. The judge listened, his expression growing more grim with each revelation. The court did not look kindly on these patterns of behavior. Leo's attorneys fought back, objecting and filing motions, but the evidence was overwhelming and the law was clear. Without a valid prenup, Chloe was entitled to an equitable distribution, half of $800 million. But then Chloe did something no one saw coming, not Leo, not his lawyers, not even her own attorney, David, at first. She didn't take half. She took what was right for the baby, a generous child support trust, a fully funded college education, lifelong healthcare coverage, and a clause stating that Leo would have 0 custodial rights until he completed a full year of behavioral therapy and proved consistent, positive involvement. That was it. She didn't take the penthouse, the cars, the offshore accounts, the art collection, or the vacation homes. Her attorney was speechless. "You're leaving hundreds of millions of dollars on the table," he said. David, however, understood. "She's not punishing him with poverty," he explained. "She's punishing him with irrelevance." "I don't need his money to prove my worth," Chloe said later. "I know my worth. My mother made sure of that." The real story broke 2 weeks later, not because Chloe held a press conference or leaked a statement. It broke because actions create ripples, and Chloe's actions were big enough to create a tidal wave. The Sophia Moreau Initiative. It announced a massive expansion, 50 new arts programs for underfunded schools across the Midwest, a state-of-the-art community arts center in Sophia's old neighborhood, and a prenatal care clinic for high-risk mothers, all funded by a single private donor, Chloe Moreau. A local reporter from Milwaukee connected the dots. A feature story ran in the paper. Local ceramicist revealed as Moreau Pharmaceuticals' heiress. The national outlets pounced. The story was perfect. A tech mogul, a humble artist, a wife betrayed while pregnant. A hidden fortune that dwarfed his own. It was the kind of story America devours, the quiet underdog who was secretly a queen all along. Leo saw the news alone in his office. Marcus was gone. The investors were backing out. Isabel had stopped answering his texts. He sat at his desk, watching Chloe's serene face on the monitor as his own turned a sickly gray. The color of a man who just realized the woman he called a nobody was worth 5 times more than everything he had ever built. He called Chloe. Her number was disconnected. He called David Price, her lawyer. David's assistant answered. "Miss Moreau is unavailable," the assistant said coolly. "Permanently." Isabel saw the news too. She was sitting in the cold penthouse, wearing Chloe's robe, drinking from one of Chloe's mugs. She watched the screen and felt a cold stone settle in her gut. She had abandoned the wife of a billionaire to become the trophy of a controlling man. The engagement ring on her finger, the enormous diamond Leo had presented with such fanfare, suddenly felt like a lead weight. A news anchor mispronounced Moreau, saying it with a hard sound instead of a soft one. Chloe didn't correct anyone. She was far too busy assembling a crib, a new one, in a new room, in a new life. The baby arrived on a Sunday morning in October. Chloe woke at 4:15 a.m. to a pressure she had never felt before. This wasn't one of the false alarms she'd had in her mother's drafty old house. This was different, deeper, more certain, the kind of pressure that arrives with authority and doesn't apologize for its timing. She called her doula, then she called Maria. Then she got dressed in the dark, grabbed the hospital bag that had been packed for 3 weeks, and drove herself to the hospital. Because she was Chloe Moreau, and Chloe Moreau did not wait for anyone to carry her, Maria arrived 20 minutes later, out of breath, her silver hair a mess, still wearing her pajama top under a winter coat. "I broke at least 3 speed limits," she panted. "Your mama would have broken 4. The labor went on for 11 hours. Chloe didn't scream. She breathed, she counted, and she gripped Maria's hand so tightly that Maria's knuckles went white. Her doula was steady and calm, her voice a constant, reassuring presence, guiding Chloe through every contraction, like a pilot talking a plane through heavy turbulence. At 3:22 in the afternoon, the baby arrived. 8 pounds, 2 ounces, a girl. She came out screaming, not crying, but screaming, a full-throated, furious scream that announced to the entire world, "I am here, I exist, make room." They laid her on Chloe's chest, warm and wet and impossibly small and impossibly loud. Chloe looked down at the face, red and wrinkled, eyes squeezed shut, mouth wide open, and felt something shift inside her. Not a physical shift, something deeper, something foundational, as if every bone in her body had just snapped into a new alignment around this one tiny person. "Hello," she whispered. "Hello, Sophia Maria Moreau?" Not Vancroft. Moreau. Her mother's name. Maria's name. A name that meant something. Maria stood beside the bed, tears streaming down her face, a tangled mess of laughing and crying. "Oh, Sophia, you beautiful thing! Your grandmother would be an absolute wreck right now, a complete mess." Theodore Moreau waited in the hallway. He had driven 3 hours from Chicago with a bouquet of white lilies, his late wife's favorite flower. He held them in his thin, trembling hands and waited patiently, the way old men do when they understand that some moments are not about them. When Chloe invited him in, he looked at the baby for a long time, his sharp blue eyes, so clear an hour ago, now soft and wet. "She has Sophia's hands," he said, and she did. Long fingers, strong, the hands of an artist. Leo was notified by a text message from Chloe's attorney. It was standard, professional, just the information a father is entitled to. His response arrived 30 minutes later. One word, congratulations. Chloe read it, set the phone down, picked up her daughter, and did not reply. Marcus Merritt sent a handwritten card that arrived at the hospital the next day. She's lucky to have you as her mother. Welcome to the world, Sophia Maria. Chloe pinned it to the nursery wall. It stayed there for years. 6 months passed the way months do when you have a newborn. Too fast and too slow all at once. Each day was a blur of feedings and diaper changes and middle-of-the-night wakings. Each day was a miracle of tiny sounds, tiny fingers, and the weight of a small head against your shoulder. Chloe moved into a craftsman house in her Wisconsin hometown. Not a mansion, not a penthouse, a home, 3 bedrooms, a garden in the back, and a porch where she could sit in the evenings and watch the fireflies. Her mother's old pottery kiln sat in the front room, which she'd converted to a studio. Chloe had it serviced and placed it where the afternoon light could hit it just right. Baby Sophia's playmat was on the floor beside it, covered with a blanket, some toys, and a wooden spoon that the baby loved more than any of them. She worked on the foundation's expansion. From the kitchen table, emails and phone calls and grant proposals were spread across the surface, surrounded by baby bottles, burp cloths, and a half-eaten sandwich. She funded the art school, opened the prenatal clinic, and established a scholarship program for single mothers pursuing higher education, naming it after Sophia, of course. Everything was named after Sophia. She ran into Isabel at a coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon in April. She almost didn't recognize her. Isabel had lost weight, the wrong kind of weight, the kind you lose when stress is eating you from the inside out. A flicker on the monitor, a shared folder she hadn't seen before named Aspen, a draft of a new project. She thought she clicked it open. Blueprints, project timelines, and photos, dozens of them, of Isabella in their bed in his robe. Making coffee in their kitchen, the screen's glow cast a cold light on Clara's face. Her breath hitched. This wasn't just an affair. This was an invasion. A second life lived in her own home. She scrolled through image after image, a nausea rising in her throat, a jealousy so sharp it felt like swallowing glass. Julian's sleek Chicago office suddenly felt like a tomb, the silence broken only by the hum of the server and the frantic beat of her own heart. She heard the elevator ding. Not with tears, not with yelling, but with a chilling stillness. Clara turned as Julian walked in. "I saw the Aspen folder," she said, her voice level, a quiet statement that shattered the world between them. He started to speak, to explain, to soften, but she held up a hand. "I don't want your excuses, Julian. I want you to understand what you've broken." She picked up her purse, walked to the elevator, and left him standing there, surrounded by the glass and steel of a life he had designed, but had just demolished. The fallout was swift. The museum board got word of the scandal not from Clara, but from a rival firm who saw an opportunity. The prestigious Lakeside Gallery project was put on indefinite hold pending an ethics review. Isabella transferred to the firm's London office and stopped answering Julian's calls, her ambition outweighing her affection. His partners began to sideline him from major client meetings. He retreated to his penthouse overlooking the city, spending his days staring at the skyline, and his evenings with a bottle of scotch, pretending he wasn't a ghost in his own life. Julian was utterly alone in the masterpiece he had built. The apartment that Clara had filled with art and warmth, the apartment where Isabella had worn his shirt and looked out at the city lights. Isabella was gone now. She had vanished after a furious argument about the canceled project, disappeared like a phantom, leaving behind nothing but the faint scent of her perfume. On a pillow, he sat at the vast marble island, the same island where he'd laid out the plans for their dream house, the same island where a cherished ceramic vase had shattered during their final fight. The stone had been repaired. You couldn't see the chip anymore. But Julian could feel the fracture lines running through his perfect world. The gilded cage had always been open. He had been his own jailer. Clara knew that now, nesting in her new apartment in a historic Chicago brownstone, with her newborn son sleeping in a bassinet beside her, she understood the trap hadn't been Julian. The trap had been believing his world of sharp lines and cold ambition was the only one that mattered. Her grandfather hadn't left her a portfolio of stocks. He had left her his entire collection of mid-century art. So she would know the value of things that last 2 months had passed. It was a Wednesday afternoon in May. The sun streamed through the bay window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Baby Leo was in his bassinet, making soft sleeping sounds with the quiet focus of someone new to the world. Clara was brewing tea, her grandfather's favorite Earl Grey, the old kettle, the only thing she took from the penthouse, sat on the stove, humming softly. The apartment smelled of old books, lemon polish, and baby powder. From the changing table in the corner, the doorbell buzzed. Mr. Abernathy stood on the welcome mat, a leather portfolio in his hand, a kind smile on his face. He held the final appraisal documents, the last signature needed to transfer the collection into her name. Quite a legacy. He said, looking at a painting hanging in the hall. Your grandfather had an incredible eye. Clara said they signed the papers on the old wooden kitchen table. Between a stack of mail and a half-eaten biscuit, $4.2 million transferred with a fountain pen that cost $2 and a signature that took 3 seconds, the most mundane act in the most profound moment of her life. Mr. Abernathy left Clara, washed the teacups, put them back in the cupboard, turned off the kettle, made a small sandwich for herself and a bottle for baby Leo, who was just beginning to stir. She ate slowly, tasting every bite. The bread was fresh. The tea was hot. The old kettle had done what old kettles do. It had remembered every morning. It had ever been used and added that warmth to this one. After lunch, she washed the bottle, dried her hands on a simple cotton towel, picked up her son, held him close to her chest, felt his solid weight against her, smelled the sweet, milky scent of him and the clean fabric of his sleeper. She walked over to the record player, sat down in a worn armchair, settled Leo in her lap. The baby reached for the spinning vinyl with his tiny fingers, her grandfather's fingers. Clara lowered the needle. The first notes of a jazz piano filled the sunlit room, soft and intricate, the same music she'd grown up with, the same music that would always feel like home. A melody doesn't change, it doesn't judge, it doesn't walk away. It stays true every time, no matter who is listening. Baby Leo stopped fussing and listened, his eyes wide with wonder. Clara began to hum along a bluesy tune from a dusty record, her grandfather's favorite, the song that was always playing when she visited his studio, the music that had echoed through his crowded, paint-spattered apartment. In Wicker Park, every afternoon after his work was done, filling the space was something that taste could recognize, but money could never truly own. She closed her eyes the way her grandfather taught her, listened to the spaces between the notes. Clara, that's where the feeling is. She trusted the music. She trusted herself at last. The melody filled the brownstone, floated through the open windows into the courtyard, where sparrows chirped, drifted down the block, where the city hummed with life, traveling outward into a world that was vast and demanding and often heartbreaking, but that also held within its noise the sound of a simple tune played with love. The shattered vase was long gone, swept up and discarded, but the collection survived. Legacies always do. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful life lessons and authentic storytelling. Every character, every scene, and every emotional moment was crafted with intention to entertain, to inspire, and to remind you that your story matters. Thank you for being part of this community.